The air at the shooting range was crisp, a typical cool English afternoon. The grounds were bustling with a mix of military veterans, enthusiastic hobbyists, and civilians. The scent of freshly cut grass was mingled with the faint tang of gunpowder, and the rhythmic crack of rifles filled the space as shooters practiced, calling out distances and wind conditions to each other. It was the club's open demonstration weekend, a time for people to showcase their skills and compare gear. Among the crowd stood Edward Hale, a guardian of the Queen, dressed in a black windbreaker, his presence almost unnoticed amidst the flashy tactical vests and custom rifles of the other attendees. His posture was perfect. His face unreadable, his eyes scanning each shooter with practiced detachment. He wasn't here to participate in the spectacle, but simply to observe. Hale was no stranger to the rigors of military training, and today, he was maintaining his proficiency in civilian ranges ahead of his unit's qualifications. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below to let me know which country you're watching from. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from. Nearby, Reese stood in the center of the firing line, a self-proclaimed expert marksman with a rifle that seemed to shine under the sun. His weapon was a customized piece of engineering, adorned with carbon fiber, a match-grade trigger, and a scope that could rival a professional sniper's. With each shot, Reese made sure to turn toward his audience, soaking up the admiration of the younger shooters who surrounded him. His words echoed across the range, punctuating the booms of his rifle. "Private contractor techniques can't teach this kind of precision," Reese declared with a smug smile, drawing appreciative nods from the onlookers. He was a man who made his living with his charisma and his rifle. His tactical sunglasses perched perfectly on his nose as he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand after drinking from a water bottle, not even looking at the person who handed it to him. The crowd watched as he continued his theatrical display, reveling in the attention. As Reese's eyes scanned the crowd, his gaze landed on Hale, who had remained silent at the periphery of the group. For a moment, there was no reaction from the Royal Guard, but that didn't stop Reese. "You one of the range staff?" he called out, a challenge in his voice. Hale simply shook his head. His eyes didn't waver from the shooting line, and there was no sign of acknowledgement or provocation. But that only seemed to intrigue Reese more. Reese smirked, dismissing Hale as another figure in the crowd. The mockery was casual, a test, but Hale didn't rise to it. Not yet. The range was an environment of controlled chaos. Tables were set up with scopes, binoculars, and the littered remains of spent brass casings. The afternoon light was soft, slanting in from above, casting long shadows on the ground where the shooters lined up. A haze of dust rose in the air as shooters paced the firing line, adjusting their positions and calling out to each other. While most shooters were focused on their targets, Hale stood at the edge of the range, barely visible among the other, more colorful figures. His presence was almost imperceptible, and it was clear to anyone watching that he wasn't here to show off. He wasn't here to impress. His role was one of observation. A quiet discipline that was far more than it seemed. Hale wasn't dressed for performance. There were no flashy tactical vests, no ostentatious displays of gear. His black windbreaker was unadorned, offering only a small glimpse of the precision and professionalism beneath. He exuded a calm stillness, the kind of stillness that soldiers learn to maintain after years of service. The same stillness that helped him remain motionless for hours during the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. But this wasn't ceremonial duty. It was something else entirely. He watched as shooters adjusted their stances, called out wind conditions, and dialed in their scopes. His eyes were sharp, not missing a single movement. Every small adjustment, every detail, was recorded mentally, his gaze never faltering. Hale wasn't a showman. His work was meticulous and silent. His hands never fidgeted. They rested at his sides, the perfect image of control. His tea, forgotten on the fence post beside him, had long since cooled. He hadn't noticed. He wasn't interested in the crowds. In the showmanship of the others. Hale's focus was elsewhere. He studied the range conditions, watching how the wind swirled the dust, how the flags flapped, how the shooters compensated for subtle shifts in the air. Hale's mind was already in the process of assessing everything around him for the quiet, professional purpose that brought him to the range that day. Training. Unlike the civilians around him, he didn't need to prove himself. He was already something more than they realized. Meanwhile, Reese had returned to his center position, picking up his custom rifle with exaggerated care, as if it were a prized possession. He had become the center of attention again, drawing in the younger shooters who gathered around him, eager to learn from someone they thought of as a true expert. With each booming shot, Reese continued to boast, his voice carrying across the range as if it were part of the performance. "That's how you do it, gentlemen," he declared proudly after hitting a distant target. His entourage nodded in approval, clearly enamored with his confidence and skill, but as Reese continued, Hale remained off to the side, an almost invisible figure. His lack of response to the spectacle did not go unnoticed. Reese, with his theatrical bravado, could not resist the temptation to call out again. "Private contractor techniques can't teach this kind of precision," he repeated, his voice almost dripping with arrogance. "But I guess you wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Hale didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the words, and that seemed to only irritate Reese more. Reese began to turn his attention toward Hale, sizing him up from a distance. There was something about Hale's stillness, his calm, that seemed to be a challenge in itself. Reese, determined to draw out a reaction, began to focus his attention solely on the Royal Guard. "You here to supervise?" Reese called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. Still, Hale didn't react. The people around them chuckled nervously, but no one spoke up. "What's the matter?" Reese pressed, "Not even a word." He sneered, raising his eyebrows in mockery. Hale stood motionless, not a hint of discomfort on his face. He was the picture of discipline, his expression unreadable. But inside, something began to change. Even though he wasn't engaging directly, the quiet buildup of tension was becoming impossible to ignore. The taunts from the onlookers continued, but Hale remained unfazed. His posture was unchanging, unmoving, and his focus unbroken. The crowd, however, didn't realize the gravity of his stillness. He wasn't just a ceremonial guard, he was a highly trained soldier, forged in real combat scenarios where the calm he exhibited could mean the difference between life and death. His background, the quiet hours standing guard at Buckingham Palace, his time spent in hostile environments where stillness meant survival, none of it was apparent to the casual observer. For them, he was just another figure in a uniform, a palace boy as they mockingly called him. But those who truly understood the nature of military service knew that the Royal work was often done quietly, without fanfare or recognition. Edward Hale wasn't there to defend his honor. He wasn't interested in responding to taunts or in showcasing his expertise. He was there for one reason, to observe and maintain his sharpness for upcoming military qualifications. As a guardian of the Queen, his job was ceremonial and public, but make no mistake, he was a soldier first. His rifle proficiency, honed over years of intense training and real combat experiences, was what made him dangerous. And it was this quiet competence that began to unsettle the crowd as they began to sense that something was different about him. But it wasn't just Hale's military record that made him formidable. It was his ability to remain calm, even in the face of mockery. This was a man who had stood motionless in front of thousands during the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace, with all the pressure and public scrutiny that entailed. But when it came time to act, Hale's training kicked in. He didn't need to talk about what he could do, he let his actions speak for themselves. The more the crowd jeered, the more Hale stayed silent. And it was this silence that slowly started to shift the mood around him. He wasn't playing to anyone's expectations, and that was becoming increasingly apparent. As the afternoon progressed, the comments aimed at Hale grew louder. By now, the crowd had begun to take sides. Some were simply observing, but many joined in the mockery, assuming that Hale's silence was a sign of weakness, a quiet admission that he wasn't equipped to participate in the competition. One man, louder than the rest, chuckled and shouted, "I thought the Royal Guard just stood around looking pretty. Don't they just pose with those big hats for tourists?" Others joined in, laughing at the suggestion that Hale's duties were purely ceremonial, that he was just an ornamental figure with no real skills. The mockery continued, with some even suggesting that the Queen's guards were nothing more than mannequins in uniforms. Hale, still standing silently at the periphery, took it all in. His expression didn't change. His eyes never wavered. He remained poised, unfazed, like a statue, a man out of place in this environment, but in reality, it was the crowd who was misplaced, misjudging him based on nothing but assumption and ignorance. Reese, seeing the mockery take hold, pushed further, growing more confident as he noticed that Hale wasn't reacting. "Are you here to show us how to pose for the brochure, mate? Do you even know how to fire that thing?" Hale's silence was still his response, but as the crowd continued to taunt, one figure in the crowd began to notice the growing tension. A retired Marine, silver-haired and with the posture of someone who had seen real combat, had been watching the situation unfold. He had seen it before, the easy dismissal of ceremonial troops by those who didn't understand the reality of their training. The Marine's eyes narrowed, sensing that something was different about this quiet figure in the windbreaker. He was no fool, he knew the signs of a true professional. And this man, this silent observer, had the look of someone who had been through far more than the crowd would ever understand. Seeing Hale remain silent, Reese's irritation only grew. The more Hale refused to engage, the more determined Reese became to draw him out, to prove that he was the better man, the better shooter. His bravado was all he had, and he wasn't about to let a palace boy steal the spotlight. "You know what?" Reese said, his voice carrying across the range. "Let's settle this once and for all. One shot each. 200 meters. Moving target. I'll show you how it's done. You'll see what real shooting looks like." The challenge was met with mixed reactions from the crowd. Some were curious to see if the quiet figure would finally rise to the occasion, while others simply watched with mild interest. The silver-haired Marine, however, tilted his head, sizing up Reese's challenge. He knew what was at stake, and he knew the stakes weren't what Reese thought they were. Hale didn't respond immediately, but there was a subtle shift in his stance. The Marine noticed it too. He had seen it before, that moment when a man who had been silent, who had been overlooked, decided that enough was enough. "I said I'm just here to observe." Hale repeated quietly, but Reese wasn't satisfied. He pressed on, a smirk crossing his face. "Yeah, I figured. They don't let window dressings touch real steel." His voice was dripping with mockery now, the crowd's laughter rising in pitch, but Hale didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply turned back toward the firing line, his gaze shifting once again to the targets. To him, this wasn't a game. It wasn't about winning a petty challenge or defending his honor in front of a crowd. It was about something much deeper, his duty to remain calm, disciplined, and prepared, no matter what. The Marine watched all of this closely. He understood exactly what was happening. And he wasn't the only one who had started to realize the true nature of Hale's presence. The crowd began to shift. The laughter grew uneasy. The Marine, observing Hale closely, recognized something deeper than what the casual onlookers could see. He understood that the silence surrounding Hale wasn't a sign of weakness, but of remarkable strength and discipline. The kind of discipline that only came from years of intense military training, a background that was both invisible and impossible to fake. The Marine stepped forward again, slowly and deliberately, his movements sharp and controlled, like someone who had spent a lifetime navigating tense situations. His eyes briefly swept across the crowd, noting the way the mockery toward Hale had started to lose its edge. The laughter had died down, replaced by quiet curiosity. "All right, son," the Marine said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, you said you were in the Coldstream Guards, yeah? Hale turned his head, acknowledging the Marine's question with a respectful nod. His response was brief but precise, Queen's Company, Coldstream Guards. The Marine's eyebrows lifted in recognition. Ah, I thought so. You lot don't say much. Do you? Hale's mouth twitched slightly, acknowledging the Marine's comment, but he didn't say anything. There was no need to. The Marine understood, this wasn't just about ceremony. It was about tradition, discipline, and a level of training that far surpassed the range showmanship going on around them. Ree, still unaware of the growing shift in the atmosphere, continued to focus on Hale, trying to goad him into a reaction. So, you're telling me you actually know how to shoot that thing? Ree asked, his tone dripping with skepticism. The Marine, sensing where this was going, turned to Ree. You ever served? He asked, his voice still calm but with an undercurrent of challenge. Ree straightened, trying to maintain his earlier bravado. I've done security work in Iraq. Different game. The Marine simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and the brief exchange hung in the air. There was something about the way he spoke, the way he dismissed the notion of private contracting, that seemed to resonate with the others around the range. The Marine knew what it took to face combat situations head-on, not in controlled conditions, but in real life or death circumstances. His tone was a subtle shift, the unspoken challenge clear. This was not about who had the best gear or the loudest voice. This was about something much deeper, the grit and experience that came from being tested in the hardest conditions. Hale, as always, said nothing, allowing the Marine's words to settle in the air. The mockery continued to fade as the reality of the situation slowly sank in. What had started as a light-hearted taunt now felt heavy with the weight of unspoken truth. The atmosphere on the range was now thick with anticipation. The challenge had been issued, one shot each, at a moving target set 200 meters away. It wasn't just a friendly competition anymore, it had become a test. A test of discipline, skill, and something that Ree hadn't accounted for, humility. Hale stood at the periphery, unperturbed, like he'd been all day. The eyes of the crowd, however, were now fixed on him. Some of them seemed to sense the shift in energy. There were murmurs of recognition, like a growing awareness that they were witnessing something beyond the usual bravado. The range officer glanced between Hale and Ree, sensing the tension rising. You up for this, guardsman? He asked Hale, his voice quieter than it had been moments before. Hale didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes swept the rifle racks, as if mentally selecting the most standard-issue weapon available. It was as if he were thinking, I don't need the fancy attachments, I just need the basics. Do you have an L85A2? He asked, his tone calm but firm. The range officer, a little surprised by the specificity of the request, answered, We've got one. Standard issue. Hale nodded, his request simple. No attachments. Just iron sights. The request for an unmodified, standard-issue rifle was not lost on the crowd. The murmurs among the onlookers grew louder. It wasn't the kind of thing that Ree, with his expensive, customized rifle, would have considered. But for Hale, it was about skill, not gear. It was a statement, I don't need the extra optics or modifications to prove my abilities. I'm good enough with the basics. Ree looked over at Hale with a mix of confusion and annoyance. This is a competition, not a training session. You sure you don't want a real rifle? But Hale didn't engage in that kind of back and forth. He had made his point. And now, with the L85A2 in hand, it was time to see if the training that had been instilled in him over years of service could shine through. The range went quiet as Hale took his position. The moving target, mounted on a rig at 200 meters, was ready. The rig would shift unpredictably, forcing the shooter to track the target and make adjustments in real time. The kind of shooting that separated the amateurs from the professionals. Hale dropped to a prone position with fluid efficiency, as though he had done this thousands of times before. His movements were automatic, each one honed over years of practice. The rifle settled into his shoulder, the weight familiar and comfortable. His body became still, each breath measured and controlled. Reese, still trying to maintain his composure, had already taken his shot. He had tracked the target, but his shot had only clipped the edge. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to show off. The crowd had watched him with admiration, but now, all eyes were on Hale. There was no fanfare, no boasting. He simply focused on the task at hand. The moving target began to shift, fast and erratic, in a way that challenged even the best shooters. Hale didn't flinch. His eyes followed the target with a steady calm, his breath steady, his focus unwavering. He exhaled, squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out across the range. The target jerked violently, and then, with a sudden stillness, it came to a stop. The bullet had hit dead center. The sound of the shot was no different from any other. But the effect was profound. The crowd fell silent. Not a cheer, not applause, just stunned silence. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. Reese squinted through his scope, looking for some sign of error, but there was none. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. There it was, the perfect shot. The one that separated the professional from the pretender. The one that said everything about Hale's skill. The range officer walked to the observation post, checking the hit on the screen. He didn't need to look closely. His voice, flat with disbelief, carried back across the range, center mass. 2 centimeters off perfect dead center. That's military qualification gold standard. The Marine, watching quietly from the sidelines, let out a soft whistle. No attachments, he murmured. No warm-up, and he still got parade polish on his boots. Reese's face turned pale. He stood there for a moment, unable to respond. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His earlier smugness was gone, replaced by a bitter taste of reality. Hale didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. There were no high fives or fist pumps. He simply flipped the safety on the rifle, handed it back to the range officer, and walked away. The silence lingered in the air as Hale stood up and walked back toward the bench where his duffel bag still sat. The crowd had begun to disperse, their conversations hushed, more subdued than before. Some whispered to each other, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Others simply stared at Hale as he walked by, their faces unreadable, but their respect unmistakable. Reese stood frozen, his custom rifle still in his hands, his earlier bravado a distant memory. He had nothing left to say. The crowd had dispersed. And the focus had shifted completely onto Hale. What had begun as a performance of arrogance had ended in a quiet realization that Hale was not just a ceremonial soldier, he was a professional, a man who had earned his place in a way they would never understand. The Marine, who had seen it all before, nodded once in Hale's direction as the younger man walked away. The respect he had for Hale's discipline and restraint was evident. He had known what was coming, even if no one else did. Not a bad shot, eh? The Marine said quietly to a nearby shooter, who could only nod in agreement, as Hale slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and walked toward the car park. No one followed. There were no jokes, no mockery. Just silence. One by one, the shooters began to realize what had just happened. The man they had dismissed had shown them all what true discipline looked like. As Hale reached his car, a voice called out to him. "You coming back next weekend?" Hale paused, glanced back with a slight smile. "Only if the Queen doesn't need me." The remark earned a few chuckles, but this time, there was no mockery. Only a deeper understanding. The kind of respect that is earned, not demanded. As Hale drove away, the sound of the rifle range faded behind him, but the lesson lingered. It wasn't about the uniform, the flashy gear, or the loudest voice. It was about quiet discipline, earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, and sometimes, that's all it takes to change the way people see you. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.